I want to start by quoting Richard Dawkins, who recently wrote in the New Statesman about what he calls the tyranny of the discontinuous mind. This is the mind that likes to put things into discrete categories, so to divide things into black and white when we all know that everything is really a shade of grey. There's so much information lost when you take out the greyness between these discrete categories. When you take out, for example, all the discussion, all the thought, all the passionate responses, all the love and debate that takes place, for example, in a theatre company's programming meetings, a Play Awards judging panel, and a Critics' Circle Award. How much is lost when it all comes down to a simple yes, no, in, out, won, lost decision? How much is lost in a newspaper's star rating system? Can someone tell me what's the difference between 3.5 stars and 4 stars? I don't know how they do that. I don't have to do it, thankfully. How much is lost when a critic, in print or in a blog, says simply, I loved it or I hated it? What is the difference between a passionate prosecutor or attacker of a production and a passionate advocate for that production? Often they come round the same way. It is a passionate response to the play, like the ends of a horseshoe. It's all in the discussion, the description and the analysis. I've sat on many judging panels and written many readers' reports, and always when the winner is announced, I thought, hey, a lot of complexity just went out the window there. A small part of this is, of course, also, hey, I didn't vote for that one. The same reservations apply to my topic here, which is new work versus adaptations. This has been a controversial topic recently, mainly for industrial reasons, I think. Like all such black-white distinctions, there's a lot of political, ideological, and cultural baggage surrounding it. The basic political industrial issue seems to be, should we applaud or program new works by Australian playwrights, or should we applaud, program adaptations of the classics by tyro young auteur directors? If only it was so simple. There's a story I've told a few times, and if you've heard it before, then please don't stop me because I want to tell it again. I was overseas when Simon Stone's adaptation of The Wild Duck opened here, and I got back. Several people who know of my great love for the classics said, oh, it's really good, but it's not Ibsen. The Wild Duck, as some of them knew, was one of my very favourite Ibsen plays. I went to see it, and it was Ibsen, just completely rewritten. It was completely old and completely new, and that's what you want in an adaptation. Later, earlier this year, I went to see Stone's version of Thyestes, based on a Greek myth full of passionate brutality, and in theory at least, drawing on the version by the literary Roman playwright Seneca. And of course, many of you would know, there's some doubt as to whether Seneca's plays were ever even written for production. The idea of narrating the original, for those of you who saw it, narrating the original in the news banner titles and then having the performed scenes circle obliquely around the key events of the story was brilliant. And the terrible central event of that famous story, of course, chimes particularly well because it was relocated towards the end of the production. And the staging was fantastic. How did they get that piano on? This seemed to be what most people who saw the play spend most of their time discussing. But it wasn't Thyestes, in a way that the Ibsen was Ibsen. Neither the play, which that's okay, nor the myth even. I have to say that I hated it. And I don't often say that about any production. I'm notorious for being a bit too gentle, some people say. I'm not saying that I didn't admire what Stone as an auteur had done, it's just that I found the text mind-numbingly banal and it didn't chime with the great and terrible myth, epic myth, which is at the heart of that story. It turned it into something banal, didn't bring it into the present world, which is what it was attempting to do, obviously. The actors stood up around on stage rabbiting on about this and that. Now, there was a script, and it has been published, and I've read it, but to a large extent, the performers seemed to be making it up as they went along. All the mocking, shocking and powerful aspects of the myth or the fable, something that Barrie Kosky never neglects, no matter how bizarre or outrageously he stages the Greek myths. All those shocking aspects were left out or alluded to in the design and between the scenes. What power it had was all in the mise-en-scène. It had a fine auteur-director whose work I admire enormously, but it sorely needed a writer. One final example before I get to my main point, Roslyn Oade's 2009 verbatim theatre piece, Stories of Love and Hate, drawing on the events and narratives surrounding the Cronulla riots in 2007. It was entirely based around her collected and edited audio-taped interviews. There was no writer, although Oade clearly has great dramaturgical skill and a vision as a director. But even without a writer, this was an utterly coherent dramatic work in a way that, for me at least, Thyestes wasn't. So what is the role of the writer in all this? Let me backtrack for a while. Because I've been around for a long time, I always go back and start talking about the 60s and 70s, because that's when I grew up. I came to adulthood during the New Wave, when the dastardly old Anglophile generation, who were stifling our supposedly national voice, distinctive national voice, were finally overthrown. It's a bit of a myth to say that playwrights did it. The ensembles of actors, directors and designers at the APG and Nimrod and other companies were extraordinarily important. But the new generation of young, mostly male, writers were one of the New Wave's most important legacies. David Williamson, Jack Hibbert, Alex Buzo, John Rumrell, you take your pick. In those days, and still I hope, I tried to support local writers and became, after an early research experience in the canonical European repertoire, an Australianist. This is not a word that we use, thankfully, much these days, because we live in a, I hope, post-nationalist age, more global and more local at the same time. And we have moved beyond many of the old totalising ideas about national identity, which so dominated public discussion in those days. But the big issue in theatrical politics in those days was naturalism, or mimetic realism. The terms were always a bit vague, as terms so often are when people write polemics. Naturalism at first seemed to be required by the urgency to represent Australians to themselves. So if that was the task, then mimetic realism or naturalism seemed to be the obvious answer way of doing it. But it was also associated with the old conservative European, especially British drama that the Anglophile generation had produced and which we were trying to overthrow. The New Wave combated this by introducing a wild new eclectic populism, reaching its peak in the cartoonish vaudeville history plays represented now by the APG's Marvellous Melbourne and in Sydney by The Legend of King O'Malley, which produced a whole new circus element to Australian theatre vocabulary, which still has a legacy today, although not quite in the same way, of course. In the 1970s, there was a sudden embrace of non-naturalistic European theatre styles. Suddenly everyone was going to France to study with Jacques Lecoq and his followers. Everyone was finding their inner clown. At its best, this produced such great actors as Geoffrey Rush, and at its worst, it produced a lot of dreadful buskers at Circular Quay. But in Australian theatre, then, the great non-realistic traditions of the early avant-garde European tradition were virtually unknown, especially, and this is another person I rabbit on about whenever I get a chance, the legendary Soviet director, Vsevolod Meyerhold, who worked with Stanislavski and who then went on to forge his own theatre. Here, for 3/4 of the 20th century, with a few exceptions, our theatre was hidebound by realism. Meyerhold was the first truly great auteur director, and he was murdered by Stalin's police in the late 1930s. You don't get much better testimony to the power of your theatre than having state cops kill you. Growing up with the Anglophilic theatre of the 1960s, I embraced the anti-naturalistic polemic of the New Wave. It's just telling a story, you know, that's so boring. In the circles I moved in, to call a show naturalistic was to dismiss it out of hand, and I'm coming to a point about this dismissing things out of hand. During the 80s, I embraced the new identity-based political multicultural community theatre movement because it was doing something new and interesting and was telling stories that hadn't previously been told. Roslyn Oade and others like her are still doing that. But again, polemic began to take over, and perfectly good work that didn't fit into the mould was rejected with a rhetorical flourish. Oh, it's so middle class. The problem always arises whenever polemic takes over from thought, when rhetoric takes over from discussion, when knee-jerk reactions take over from critical responsiveness to what a new work is doing. So when, long after the new wave and the political theatre of the 1980s, a new generation of directors here emerged to challenge the old representational theatrical styles, starting with Kosky, leading on to Benedict Andrews and the other young Tyro directors now, almost all of them male, we might come back to that point, I embraced their work and still do. Much has been made of their links with modern European post-dramatic styles, especially what is increasingly and sinisterly coming to be dismissed rather cavalierly as the German connection. I hate the fact that yet again polemic is creeping in, and the interesting innovations in our theatre are being rejected out of hand. In some circles now the term auteur-director has become a term of abuse. Some internet trolls, and that's a whole new phenomenon that we might discuss later on this morning, are now attacking any director who has an original vision and something to say on their own account. These young, arrogant men, we are told, don't have respect for the text. Surely we got over that a long time ago, especially classic texts where the author's dead and not there to complain. It reminds me of the old critics of mass culture in the early part of the last century who dismissed such newfangled forms as old film and jazz because they were not high art. These embattled high culture defenders and apologists were happy to be respectful of the work of Meyerhold's contemporary friend and collaborator Sergei Eisenstein, but on the whole they dismissed all film as a crap medium that softened the brains of the masses and was complicit in the destruction of civilised values. The serious academic studies such as those by very different critics such as Richard Hoggart and Theodore Adorno were more complex than that, but now their legacy is polemical and unfortunately it still lingers. So after this overlong preamble, the first thing I would like to say to you playwrights is don't ever be seduced by the rhetoric, by the polemic. Don't ever start using descriptive terms such as naturalistic, political and auteur-director as simple terms of abuse. I'm in a difficult position here, I know, because as a champion of Australian playwrights for 40 years, I now seem to be in another camp, championing a new theatricality that to some people seems to disrespect the text, the scripts you write. This is why I started with the reference to Dawkins, the tyranny of the discontinuous mind. As a theatre-goer, I now want to watch the continuities between the work of Australian playwrights and the work of the new directors. I know that there are some important industrial and financial issues here, involving job opportunities and the chance to get your plays on. I know that every time an auteur-director doing a clever adaptation of a classic gets programmed for a season, that it means that one of your plays gets left out. I don't want to trivialise these really important considerations, but I do want to argue, at least in blue sky sort of terms, that there is or ought to be a continuity between new local works telling local stories and new versions of the classics in which our writers, as well as our directors, appropriate the old texts. This year, Benedict Andrews will be directing Three Sisters for the Young Vic in London, but before that, he's also directing his own play, Every Breath, at Belvoir. Simon Stone's version of the classics are notorious, of course, for being, in effect, new plays. Playwrights are doing it too. Our host today, Kate, wrote the astonishing The Seed, a story so local that she played in it a character based on herself. And then she turned around last year and adapted Julius Caesar in a bold new version in which she had Brutus's wife, Portia, narrate most of the action of the final two acts, which, let's face it, are a bit of a letdown in the original. She's got an adaptation of Medea coming up this year at Belvoir, and I'm very much looking forward to it. I've always loved and respected the classic plays, and I still reread them often. But I am the first to admit that mostly they need a bit of wrangling if they are to become exciting experiences in the theatre now. I think you could all help with that. You should still keep telling your original stories, obviously, but please don't put yourselves as playwrights on one side of a discontinuity with you, to vary the image, with you in one corner of the boxing ring and the auteur directors with directing classics in another. The second part of what I want to say here is that we can all learn from, and in your case exploit, the theatrical inventiveness of the new Tyro directors, no matter how ego-driven we might think them to be. or no matter how much we might worry about them trying to take over the role of the writer in the theatre process. In the late 1970s, I worked for several years for what was then called the Australian National Playwrights Conference, and we seemed to spend an awful lot of time saying to playwrights in our reports and our dramaturgical work on their plays, you can't simply write in your stage directions, a storm sweeps in and carries them all away. Shakespeare and Ibsen both wrote scenes in which something like that had happened. But for a long time, Australian playwrights were somehow not allowed to do it. The stage couldn't do it, it wasn't realistic. It seems silly now, but for a long time Australian playwrights were somehow in the thrall of directors who told them what they could and couldn't write. I worry that they are in the thrall of the new ones now. Back in the 1970s, in a theatre scene that valued realistically represented kitchen and lounge room settings, with people sitting around arguing in them and perhaps falling in or falling out of love, we used to say of the dreams and magic of the non-realistic theatre that Maya Holt started introducing, the theatre cannot do that. Well, it can. It always could in different styles and traditions. And somewhere along the way in the 20th century in this country, we did lose track of that. To take another recent example of a show that some of you might have seen, I like to think that in the original script of A History of Everything, the lovely little show that the Belgian company Entre and Good, if I pronounced that properly, did at Sydney Festival in January, someone wrote, and I like to think that they wrote, as a stage direction for the final scene, we see the Big Bang, the origin of the universe. They certainly staged it, and for those of you who, in very simple terms, for those of you who missed it, it was absolutely stunning, completely convincing. We knew that we were at the Big Bang, at the origin of the universe. The show even got a review in New Scientist, which is not a magazine that often pays very much attention to the theatre. So I would like to say to all the playwrights here that you can write stage directions like that. They can do it. And that is because we have a new theatrical vocabulary now, far removed from the old naturalism that I grew up with. The auteur directors and their stage and lighting designers should be your friends as a writer. Now, I got into a bit of trouble for liking Simon Stone's production of Barrie recently. I'm sorry to keep harping on about Stone, but he just happens to have these 3 interesting productions in the last couple of years. But I also know that Brecht, who wrote that, a bit juvenile play, as a very young man, wanted Barrie to go out into the forest at the end and to have a terrible, existentially confronting, life-terminating but exhilarating experience. He wrote the scene, and it's pretty good on the page for a young writer, and Simon Stone and Nick Schleifer did it, in one of the most astonishingly simple and bold pieces of staging seen on the Sydney stage for a long time, because, partly, it was not at all representational. Barrie stood on the speaker box with his guitar in the dark and in the pouring rain, for those of you who saw the production will remember, absolutely wonderful, drenching rain, and played his ass off. In the audience, we were seriously worried that the actor might electrocute himself. It was that scary, and it's his intent to be. The water pouring down on him. There was no realistic representation of the dark forest that we all knew, but we all knew that here was a place in which Barrie had come to find his nemesis. Now, I know many people hated that production, and that's fine. I got a lot from it, and that's just me. But I think that as writers, you should all take comfort from its astonishing theatrical power, which even its detractors acknowledged, and not see the playwright versus director thing as an us versus them situation. I read a lot of large-scale, serious science fiction. Kim Stanley Robinson, Stephen Baxter, China Miéville. My recent favourite is Paolo Bacigalupi's, I can't pronounce anything today, wonderful novel, The Wind-Up Girl. Although I'm not a regular film goer, I sometimes wonder why these great works have never made it to the movies, and I think it's because they're too big for the screen. But they're certainly not too big for the stage. I now read, or want to read, plays set in Gothic bushland with ghosts haunting an ancient landscape. I haven't even begun to mention the wonderful staging work of the company My Darling Patricia. Plays set in haunted rooms with extraordinarily complex time frames, set in mean urban streets with weird biologically engineered characters, set in cyberspace, set in Mars. Plays that are nightmares, plays high on crystal meth, plays fuelled by dreams. So please be bold in your demands. Don't feel that you are somehow in competition with the auteur directors doing the adaptations of the classics. The new theatrical vocabulary that they are forging will be very good for your work in the long run, when you get your new plays on. And I know that's part of the problem. In my early years as a theatre goer, nothing was possible if it didn't happen in a living room. Now, thanks to the auteur directors and designers, everything is possible, even the Big Bang. So write it in, anything you want, they can do it.